Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lecture series. We are proud to have all of you here tonight. We are going to tell you a little bit about the upcoming lectures and our exhibit that is in, and then I'm going to hand this over to Josh and Sandy. Our next two lectures are in December. December 4th from 5 to 6 is Saving the Mining Structures by J.R. Richards and Clark Martinez. And those two will be talking about saving the mining structures in town and give you more information about what they're planning on doing. This is a Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History lecture, and so that will be more about what's coming up. So we hope you join us for that one. And then we have a Jacob Riis lecture on December 10th. Please come and see our exhibit on Jacob Riis, and this will go along with our exhibit. And it's being given by Professor Matt Basso from the University of Utah. So those are what's coming up. And tonight we're going to talk about the park's most murderous score. Sandy Brumley and Josh Grotstein are going to talk to you about this. So Sandy has a B.A. in economics from Northwestern University and an M.B.A. in marketing and finance from the Columbia University Graduate School of Business. His principal qualifications for the Most Murderous project are a love of reading newspapers and a desire to know the truth. Sandy's partner in crime, Josh, has a B.A. in comparative literature from Brown University and an M.B.A. from the Harvard Business School. Together, they're probing the public record and asking the logical questions of history to determine the story behind the facts. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Josh and Sandy, and I will let them talk to you about it. Josh and Sandy, thank you for joining us tonight.
Outstanding. Thank you, Diane, for the great introduction. First of all, I'd like to do a quick shout out to our facilities here. We're at the Park City Audio Visual Studio, and they are graciously providing the services that you're seeing. It allows us to stop being talking heads and become talking torsos, so it's a big advance. And so tonight we are indeed going to talk about the park's most murderous score. What that's about is the first 20 years of Park City's history. And we're looking at the fact that this was a Wild West town. There were very many murders. We're going to get into the details around that. And here we go.
So let's bring up the PowerPoint.
Diane, can you re-enable the screen sharing?
There we are. And now we'll bring up the PowerPoint. Oh. Okay, let's just, there we are. And we are all set. Okay. So there's a little known period in our Park City history when, Sandy?
Well, the town was frustrated, right? There was what was seen as a weak and ineffective judicial system. This led the town basically to take the law in their own hands. Some would call it vigilante justice, and I think I would too. Here, what happened was the entire town got upset with a murder that happened. And it was not just a few individuals, it was a large number of folks. And so it's difficult to imagine that in a town of, say, 1,500 to 3,000 people, many more folks knew about this. And what's curious about that is that after the act happened, after the lynching happened, the town went silent.
Yeah, and so basically what we're going to present to you today in the following slides is this unique time in this series of unusual and very remarkably intertwined events that led up to a series of murders in the park.
So as background research, we looked at all of the murders that happened that were referenced in Park City. We started in 1875, which was about when the town was, when there was more than 2 or 3 people here. And we looked all the way out actually to just after the turn of the century. But what we found was that between 1875 and 1895, there were 30 murders. There was concentration of murders. About 13 of them happened in the 4 years between 81 and 84. A lot of them were just sort of heat of the moment mistakes, you know, one drunk guy shooting another in a saloon, another case of a guy sort of unhappy with the pharaoh hand that he was dealt, and he shot his dealer. So some were odd. There's a story about a Mormon that ended up blowing up both of his wives. One of them apparently by mistake. You know, he had one, he picked up another, he wanted to shed the first one, brought some powder home. Somehow the cabin blew up. No. Bye-bye, ladies. So another one's a little sad, but you know, a father ends up killing his son with an oxbow. The son's going to run away, so the solution is Yet another one is a quarryman getting his shave and a haircut for 2 bits, gets into an argument over his barber about the bill, and bam.
As one does.
So finally, there's another one that's fairly well known around town. A young woman was killed by her own uncle because of a dalliance with a boy. So. Many sort of strange murders out there, but
6 of these really string together in a very unique way, and we're going to tell you the story of these 6. Okay,
here you go.
Okay, so what we've done is we've bucketed these 6 into 3 different categories: the trigger murders, the lynchings themselves, and a retribution murder that took place 4 years later. So the first 3 are the triggers that lead up to these lynchings. The first one is John Turner. We'll tell you his story. And then Marshall Andrew Burt down in Salt Lake City, and we'll tell you the story about Burt. Then Matt Brennen, or Brennen, and let's give a little shout out to Lynn Bradshaw, who basically alerted us to the fact that the person formerly or previously known as Matt Brennen may have actually had the name Matt Brennen. We saw a headstone today with the Brennen name. Now you'll see some newspaper articles that say Brennen. It could be Brennen or Brennen. We went with Brennen because of the tombstone.
But somebody made a typo.
Someone made a typo. So these are the 3 triggers that lead into 2 lynchings. One is of Joe Harvey with the Marshall Andrew Burt murder. And then 2 days after that lynching, there is a lynching up in Park City. This is the famous or infamous one with Black Jack Murphy, or John Murphy. And then 4 years later, after all of this takes place, there is another murder that's very suspiciously interesting because it's probably linked to this as well.
So murder number 1, John Turner. He's a young man, a 20-year-old. He's basically setting out to make his fortune in Park City. And he shows up in town with 2 what are called outfits. That is basically a team of horses and a wagon. He's a young Mormon man, and so this is a fairly typical business for Mormons to engage in. You know, they wouldn't work in the mines by edict from Brigham Young, but you know, anything, you know, selling services and goods to the miners, you know, that was goodness, and that was why he was here. So he shows up on June 30th. By July 3rd, he's run into a guy who's calling himself Fred Welcome. It turns out Fred Welcome is using a fake name. His real name is Fred Hopt. And the scurrilous background on that is that prior to this event, Welcome had been arrested by Junior's father, John Turner Sr., who's the sheriff of Provo. And as a result of that interaction, Welcome had sworn revenge on John Sr. So they get together, you know, Welcome is enticing Turner with the possibility of employment. But when Turner Jr. goes to sleep, Welcome goes and strikes him dead with an axe. And this actually happened right up in Deer Valley, you know, near the ski area. At the end of the murder, you know, he basically cleans up by taking Turner and wrapping him in his own tent and throwing him in the back of his own wagon. So as the days go forward, after July 3rd, next day is July 4th, Welcome and a friend of his named Jack Emerson spend the day drinking and reveling with the other Parkites. I understand that was a big party time of the year for them. And so they spend actually July 4th and July 5th, you know, just hanging out and drinking. On July 6th, they decide to get out of Dodge or Park, and they they get into the wagons with Welcome driving one and Emerson driving the other, and reportedly a large supply of whiskey. So I guess they wanted to stay on a roll there. So as they're coming out of town, going through Wanship, they actually run into Sheriff Edward Allison, who's the Summit County Sheriff. And he converses with them briefly, but doesn't see anything suspicious, so they roll on. They spend the night in Echo Canyon, which is where Welcome tries to sell one of the outfits to a passerby. This is kind of how, the trail of breadcrumbs that he's leaving that allow them to track him down. And when Emerson goes to sleep, Welcome apparently takes the body out of the back of the wagon, stashes it in the bush, and by July 10th, the body's discovered.
So this is interesting. So Emerson is with Welcome this whole time. There is the dead body in the back of this wagon, Turner, and Emerson hasn't smelled it or hasn't noticed it.
Well, it certainly implicates him now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a little fishy to me.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here on this slide is a map of the journey that John Turner Sr. took in tracking down Fred and Jack. So a little background. Senior.
So this was a bike ride he took?
Well, good point, Josh. Actually, I looked on the Google Maps for either horseback riding or stagecoach. Those weren't one of the buttons, but I thought maybe bike riding would be the closest way to have a rough ride.
Well, try Strava next time, but go ahead.
All right, thank you for the endorsement. So anyway, Senior had been in close contact with Junior. He's setting off on his life, and Dad wants to stay in touch. And they're in contact by telegraph, but the contact ends. He's not hearing back from Junior. So what's happening in this time? On July 8th, Welcome is continuing out of town. He arrives in Piedmont, Wyoming, where he finally sells one of the rigs. And the person he sells it to, insists on it happening in front of a sworn notary. So now there's a paper trail. And so they roll on, they get to Hilliard, Wyoming, and Welcome at that point gives some of Junior's clothes to Emerson in the presence of others. Here's a present for you. Doesn't say where he got them. Clearly it didn't come from Macy's. Anyway, so they roll on to Green River, where Welcome sells the second outfit. And for whatever reason, Emerson and Welcome part ways. Continuing on, Turner finally receives a dispatch indicating that one of Junior's rigs has been sold. July 10th, the body is discovered in Echo Canyon. And so by July 20th, Dad's going to go out and try to track down who he thinks killed his son.
And this is going to be an 1,100 mile or almost 1,200 mile trek journey. That's pretty amazing. Was this, did the people in the park in Salt Lake know what was happening here at the time?
Well, the people in the park had heard about the murder, just that there's a body found. And then, as news reaches the newspapers that it's father tracking the killer of his sons, there's more and more articles reporting on it. So throughout the region, people are aware as this crime and tracking unfolds. So the capture of Fred and Jack. Turner's Senior is following the trail. He locates these various items of property that have been sold along the way. And he reaches out to the Union Pacific detectives, probably hoping to, head Welcome off, if he's trying to escape by train. He arranges a meeting with a Union Pacific detective in Cheyenne. And while the two of them are sitting in the rail car, who should walk by the window outside but Fred Welcome? So that's how they spot him and capture him. He's officially arrested by Sheriff Allison because it's a crime that's committed in Summit County. At that point, Welcome tells Allison, I'm not the killer, it was Emerson. So, of course, they continue to pursue. Senior in particular returns to the pursuit of Emerson. And then,
yeah, well, it's amazing. Emerson turns himself in, but he did it in a very sporting way. Just to read from the Herald article, actually the posting that he had in the paper. I see by the papers that I am accused of murdering John Turner. I can be found here at any time, Jack Emerson. That's,
So is it sporting or is it resignation to what's about to happen?
Whatever it is, it made it easy for law enforcement.
Yep, so they catch him and they take him back to Salt Lake City and let the trials begin. So we're showing here a list of 4 trials. I'm going to talk to you in just a little bit of detail around the first 2 because they figure prominently in really setting the stage for what follows in the rest of this presentation. So on the first trial, it happens fairly quickly. The murder happens in late 1880. By 1881, there's a trial. Welcome is found guilty. At that time in the state of Utah, you got to choose your poison, right? Would you want to be hung or to be shot? At that point, Welcome chooses to be shot. And then what happens is the first of several kickbacks on the trial. Due process has apparently not been followed. The defendant takes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court kicks it back to the state. So a new trial is fielded in 1883. Again, the verdict is guilty. This time, for whatever reason, Welcome chooses to be hung. Yet again, the Supreme Court kicks it back.
So this is interesting. If we pause here for a second, there's going to be 2 more trials of Welcome in 1884 and 1885, and eventually Welcome or Hopped is shot and killed. He's found, and it's not reversed.
Justice is achieved.
However, justice is not being achieved at where we are in time in 1883. And so it's very understandable how frustrations could be rising, not just down in Salt Lake, but particularly up in the park. This is all of a sudden they've seen this situation, they've watched it in the papers, and it hasn't been justice served, and feel as though something's amiss here.
Yep.
Hey, Diane, we're going to throw out to you. Any questions to this point?
Yes. Were you guys able to determine whether this murder rate 30 over 20 years was the highest for the 20-year period in the park? Was this the most murderous time?
Yeah, that's pretty much the net there. When you look across, I actually ran it out to the early 1900s. Basically just doing a literature search, right? So I'm searching on murder in Park City. And the 30 murders turn up very clearly in the newspapers, and then the newspapers go silent about further murders.
So either there was no murders or they weren't being reported, but probably the former. Anything else, Diane?
What happened to Emerson? Why wasn't he found guilty of murder?
So Emerson was kind of seen all along as more of an accomplice. The newspaper reports of the time seem to suggest that, maybe he was just there for the whiskey.
Great.
And we have one more. Why would the U.S. Supreme Court get involved in the sentence?
Great question.
Well, of course, the defendant's lawyers took it to the Supreme Court. As I looked at it, it seemed to be procedural issues. But there are some who say, including our friend Lynn, who suggests that the Supreme Court was upset with the fact that Western courts were very quick to either pull the trigger on shooting a murderer or to hang him. That was seen in the West as the appropriate retribution, and the courts maybe weren't necessarily so sure of that.
So let's keep going.
So, murder number 2, what the Park Record called the cowardly murder. Josh and I spent a lot of time thinking about, are they really referring to, Blackjack's murder of Brennen, or ultimately, there's a little ambiguity there. Could it be
the town? The town.
So the story, though, is that that Brennen is shot by a pretty high caliber rifle with a large black powder charge. So the example here happens to be a Sharp 50-90. It's a sniper rifle. It's also, after the Civil War, was used to shoot buffalo in large quantities. And so someone shot Brennen with a big gun.
So talk to us about the use of the word apparently.
The story of the shooting at the time is that Brennan's on his horse. He's talking to a couple of guys that are staking a claim. And basically the shot rings out and he falls forward out of the saddle. As the two claim stakers approach him, you know, he basically says, Blackjack Murphy done shot me.
Okay, so he's facing the other way.
Yes.
He's shot in the back.
Yes.
And he's dying. And he claims that someone who shot him from the back, he can identify him. So is that the
Well, so Murphy had been on the scene. He'd recently sort of passed by. He went off in the direction of where the shot was fired, but that's pretty circumstantial, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
So murders 3 and 4. You know, immediately after the shooting in the park down in Salt Lake City, a rapid sequence of events happens. So a black man named Joe Harvey is trying to find work. He goes on a job interview with an innkeeper, and the innkeeper reports that you know, for him to do this job, he's going to have to go fairly far out of town. He doesn't like the commute. So somehow things escalate, and he ends up brandishing a gun at the employer. There's a lot more detail about him wandering off and going to a drugstore. But what happens is the innkeeper calls the police officer, or calls actually the marshal of the town on a telephone. The telephones are there at that age. And then the marshal shows up, and when he does, Marshal Byrd is shot by Harvey. Now, the marshal's accompanied by other officers who are able to capture Harvey and get the gun away. They take him into the town jail, but in very fast order, a crowd of about 2,000 forms outside of the jail. They're chanting, they want a lynching, they want to string this guy up. And unwisely, perhaps, one of the police officers sticks his head out the door, figuring he's going to calm the town down. And that's not what happens. They rush him, they get inside the jail, they grab Harvey, they beat him, and they take him out in the yard and they lynch him. And not satisfied with that, they actually drag him around town for a while. So this is a brutal murder.
So this is a brutal murder that seems to have come to a head like a flash mob. This didn't seem to be planned. This seems to be heat of the moment, which is very different from what we're going to see up in the park in a few days. So let's take a pause here. We're in August of 1883. And the mood in the park is very interesting. We have mounting frustration both in Salt Lake and in the park with a federal and state judicial system that seems to be working against justice in Utah based on the welcome retrials. Just a few days ago, we have Matt Brennen being shot by Blackjack Murphy. So we have some gunpowder that's really kind of in a big barrel. All of a sudden a match is thrown into it, if you think of it that way, by the murder lynching in Salt Lake City. And in fact, on August 25th, 1883, in the park record, 2 articles show up, conflated together, the murder lynching down in Salt Lake and the murder of Matt Brennen. So it's easy to speculate that in the park, they saw what happened down, they're frustrated, they saw what happened down in Salt Lake City with the lynching. They see that Brennan's been killed, and they think to themselves, maybe we can take justice into our own hands the way that folks in Salt Lake did too.
So let's talk about what happened to Murphy. He appears in town on Wednesday, the same day of the murder, and he's arrested by Jack Pape, a colorful character who's a saloon keeper in town. He owns a saloon called the Grizzly. But he's been deputized by Captain Greenman, the town marshal, to go look for Jack Murphy. Once Murphy's arrested, Greenman ends up turning Murphy over to the Summit County Sheriff, or his deputy there in town. And the reason is that there was not an effective jail cell at that point. Some people say that there was none. That's kind of what I believe, because the town jail wasn't really built until 1884. So there was no safe place to keep Jack Murphy.
But couldn't it also have been the case that they wanted to get him out of town because they feared a lynching?
Exactly.
Okay.
There was already talk of lynching, fairly common in any Western town at that point. So what happens is then on Friday night, or on Thursday, he's taken down to Colville. There's still some nervousness in Colville about whether the folks from the park are going to come over and fetch Blackjack. So Friday night, Milt Thomas, the deputy, and D.F. Condon, who's a fairly prominent miner here in town, they take Blackjack out into a wheat field near the Weaver River for safekeeping. So they're out there for a night. For whatever reason, on Saturday, they decide to come on back to Colville. And so he's locked back in the jail. Meanwhile, back in the park, on that Saturday night, a group of masked men are organized to hijack the Utah Eastern train that runs back and forth between the park and Colville. Many of these men are actually dressed as women, so that's kind of a funny story. But clearly, the purpose is to hide their identity, both from the train men who are not active part of the lynching. It's clear this lynch team is very highly organized. About 30 of them are on the train. It's a train with just the caboose attached, so they load up that caboose with a group of folks. And the reason is when they get to Colville, they want to control the scene. They arrive in town, they've got the train at the station, and then between the station and the jail, they're making sure that they can go and fetch Blackjack and bring him back. So very organized plan.
Unlike what we saw down in Salt Lake,
Right.
which was a flash mob coming together in the heat of the moment, this is a planned, premeditated lynching.
And so, as you and I have discussed, it's a little bit like Ocean's 11, right? It's a very well-organized plan.
Right.
They go into the jail, and the first challenge that they run into is that there's no key. And so they have to spend a fair bit of time fiddling with the hinges and the lock. Finally, they get the gate off the jail, and they go to fetch Blackjack, and they pull him, and there's another guy attached. Clearly Allison is worried about this. He's thrown up kind of a couple of last defenses, but as the story goes, the extra baggage is detached, the train is boarded, Blackjack comes back, and yet another crowd is back here in the park, protecting the environs around the train station and basically making it possible for them to hold, their vigilantes trial in the street and string them up on a telephone.
So this wasn't just a few people. This is a lot of folks.
No, there were a lot of folks involved. So the outcome, as reported in the paper initially, is that Sunday morning, Blackjack is found hanging from a telegraph pole with a note stuffed in his boot that has either the number 77 or LL written on it. There's some uncertainty in the newspaper reporting at the time.
What do you think the 77 would mean?
Well, the 77, is actually my preferred interpretation of that little note because there are stories about other letters being sent to people who are talking about the murder. And the letter comes from the 77 saying, you better keep quiet.
So this is the 77 people involved with the murder?
Well, let's take a look at the note itself. Eventually.
Yeah. So what we thought we'd do here is let Blackjack tell his own story. For those of you who've been to the museum before, I'm sure you've seen this, and this is a very colorful way of letting you know what happened.
Well, I got no hope of getting justice in this mining camp. The vigilantes will see to that. Well, back in August of 1883, I saw that old prospector, Matt Brennen, snooping around. So I shot him clean out of his saddle right at the bottom of Iron Canyon. Brennan's dying words were, Blackjack Murphy done me in. The three men that heard him grabbed their guns and they ran up to my cabin. Well, I realized I didn't have a chance, and so I snuck out the back and turned myself into the sheriff and locked me up in the county jail. Well, I reckoned I was safe there, but Park City's residents were in a rage. As I was waiting in the jail for the judge to come, why, they kidnapped the train crew and fired up the engine, and they all came to Colville. Well, they all had guns, and my cowardly jailers, they turned me over to the mob, and that's how I got back here in Park City. Well, them vigilantes, they never waited for a judge. They just gave me a trial of their own, and they found me guilty, and they sentenced me to hang by the neck until I was dead.
Not a happy outcome.
No, it was not. But let's go back to the mood in the park now in 1883 and reprise that. You know, basically, we've seen all these murders and leading up from the Turner situation with the welcome injustice, the 2 murders down in Salt Lake City, and Matt Brennen being shot, and now the final retribution and lynching of John Blackjack Murphy. It's interesting to look at the papers at the time, and there's a great headline: "Infection Thrice Infected, a ball which a Salt Lake City mob set rolling reaches Park City." So even at that time, they were linking these lynchings together. They were basically saying, this is a newfangled thing that's happening in our area. We're taking law into our own hands down in Salt Lake. We're doing it again in Park City.
Well, even the lynch mob down in Salt Lake, their chant after they finished with their act was to say, you know, let's get welcome next. So no question, these events were connected. So finally, we get to see our note that's either the 77 or LL. This little facsimile that I put together is based on the written description from one of the newspapers. And it described the paper as having come out of a notepad, and then that the numbers or the letters had been written in pencil. But the really sort of interesting thing is that the description was that multiple hands had apparently written the numbers. So I don't know about you, Josh, but I'm very inclined to speculate that that's a little bit of a contract.
It sounds like
right?
omerta. It sounds like a kind of a law of silence and secrecy.
And so, so the 77 was sort of a force on one side. The next day, tacked to the door on the coroner's office is a note with this little sort of facsimile of a coffin drawn on it. And the note says, it accuses 8 specific people. So we're going to take a little closer look at who these folks were. Many of them were prominent townspeople. And the note itself seems to actually be written by 2 people. There's kind of 2 different tones to it. But the gist of the note is, well, as it says, "You are hereby notified under pain of death to absent yourselves without the least possible delay." You can't read that any other way, right?
That's probably very true.
So the gist is, you guys got to get out of town. You know, you lynched him. You can't do this. It's, you know, so there's this countervailing force.
So it's signed by a Captain Jack from the MMG Invincible Corps.
Who is that?
Yeah, who is that?
Right. So so there was a group in operation in Ireland at the time called the Invincibles. So they seem to be connecting themselves to that. What the Invincibles were a couple of folks that slayed a British agent in Dublin, and they were actually pursued. It was a global pursuit. They were captured elsewhere in Europe, and finally, you know, the Invincibles were hung. So there's that connection. But you know, our friend Lynn tells us that the Molly Maguires, there's a certain additional intrigue that comes from that. The Molly Maguires were an Irish group that organized basically to promote the rights of workers. So you know, the thinking is that maybe you know, John Murphy was a union organizer, and he ran afoul of the miners. It's certainly intriguing to speculate about that as well.
So sides are drawn between the 77 and the Invincibles.
Yep. So let's look at the people they're accusing. Again, it kind of, as we said earlier, there's some prominent citizens. They're talking about A.J. Moore, the coroner. They're talking about David Condon. He's actually the guy that tried to protect Blackjack and took him out in the wheat field. He's on the list of accused. One of the early merchants in the park, a guy named W.H. Roy, a fellow named Hank Clemens, who was a night watchman in town. J.R. or James Lane was the assistant foreman of hose for the fire company.
Oh, that wasn't Lady Stockings, okay.
No.
Okay.
So Truman Shank, president of the Uinta Mining Company, probably the most prominent name on the list. They owned and operated the the California and Comstock mines. And then 2 of the trainmen. Now we got Joe highlighted here because there's further story to come on him. But
so Sandy, all of these 8, and it's interesting why there's just 8 if there was 77 folks, but that's another question. But they all seem to be linked to different secret societies.
Right,
in town?
exactly. So in the 1880s, there were organizations. These are familiar names, right? The International Order of Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias, the Ancient Order of United Workers. Those were the fraternal organizations, or literally, as they called them, secret societies. These groups had actually gotten together to build a town, or to build a hall that they called Society Hall. So at the time of these murders, that hall was under construction, and these guys had membership in these various organizations.
So they'd be familiar with keeping secrets in the little societies, or the big societies.
Maybe a little bit like an interlocking corporate board, right?
Interesting. Very interesting. Let's Diane, any questions up till now? Any new ones that have come in?
Yes, we have quite a few. Is there any speculation as to why there wasn't an inquiry into the Harvey lynching in Salt Lake City?
Yeah, interesting question. I certainly didn't see anything in the newspapers, which is why I kind of say that. You know, speculation is that, you know, this was an act that happened in the heat of passion. And indeed, the news reports around it discuss the fact that there were many saints involved. So the saints was kind of the informal term for members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And so one wonders if, you know, maybe the church didn't just kind of try to sweep that under the rug.
Do you think there may have also been a racial aspect to it?
You know what? You're right. Right. This is a black man. Black men were lynched very frequently in the days after the Civil War. So certainly that was a factor.
Diane, any more questions?
Why only these 8 if so many were allegedly involved?
That's a great question.
Yeah, good question. You know, my sense from reading it is that these guys are accused of being the ringleaders. So, you know, if you're going to organize that many people, you've got to have some adept managers. And so it's certainly fun to speculate that, you know, this wasn't just, you know, a bunch of miners and muckers getting organized, that, you know, that membership, you know, of the management class were involved. And while, you know, you don't see any listings here of the other secret societies, they were all in discussion. You know, so the prominent members of town, you know, the Ferries and the Chambers, they were members of, you know, yet another organization, the Masons. So there's really a kind of a web of these secret societies. And, you know, why, you know, Captain Jack chooses to accuse these folks, lost to history. There's no detail on that.
Diane?
And we had a question a couple slides back. What do you think led to the public anger?
Josh, you love this aspect.
Well, you know, I think a lot of this has to do with, you know, the story we're telling here. You know, our speculation is, of course, that, you know, the lack of the feeling that the federal and state judicial systems aren't taking care of them, that they're not meting out justice the way they should in the Welcome situation. That certainly is one issue. There is certainly the, you know, seeing with, you know, the Brennen murder herself. I guess Sandy would Brennen have been a particularly beloved character in Park City?
Yeah, the news stories at the time talk about Brennen having been a very popular character. He was popular here in town. People knew him from the Comstock load back in Nevada. And on the other hand, Black Jack, I mean, one of the reasons for his nickname is that he was not apparently very likable. A lot of people just didn't like him. I don't know whether he was nasty or irascible. You know, the news reports aren't specific, but he was not liked and perhaps therefore an easy target.
And
Diane?
last question, could the 77 note in his hanging boot have anything to do with the nearby shoe tree origin? And for those who don't know, yeah, if for those of you who don't know, there are trees that people hang shoes on. So
yeah, right along the edge of Poison Creek, if you're coming up Deer Valley Drive, you will see a tree on the right. Now, most of these shoes are like ski boots and hiking boots.
Right.
So, and I've never counted them. You think there's 77 up there? Maybe that's it.
That's very funny. Let's move on.
All right, so yeah, let's think about this silence, right? You know, how does that happen? You know, there's a news article that kind of speaks pretty directly to it, and I think it's worth kind of quoting aspects of it. At the beginning, it says, you know, in a place like Park City, where the people have endured so much, it seems hardly probable that any demonstration would grow out of this affair. So this is just days after the event. The speculation is nobody's going to talk about this.
But this is down in Salt Lake. They're basically saying, we know Park City, and we know that Park City, if anything happened, and it probably did, they're not going to say anything about it.
They ain't going to tell us Mormons.
Yeah.
And then the closing line I particularly like, you know, we feel like predicting that the matter will rest where it is and where it should, that Parkites will calm down to a routine life, and here's the best bit, and all will move along again as merry as Byron's marriage
That's
ball.
a great line. Or as that famous line in Chinatown goes, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown, or in this case, it's Park City.
I wonder if that's where they got that.
No, maybe.
Anyway, you know, the local authorities are not happy. You know, there's a lot of noise in the press. You know, how come, Sheriff Allison, how come you can't keep lynchings from happening? And so a grand jury is convened. A fellow named Judge Robert Hunter convenes and does an investigation. Takes between 30 and 60 days, depending on which newspaper you read. But ultimately, it's very difficult to find anything else about what went down in that grand jury. I did a fair bit of digging. The press accounts are kind of few and far between. You know, I reached out to the Summit County Courthouse. They don't have anything. They bounced me to the Research Center of Utah. Nothing there. The Utah Archives, they don't have anything. I even checked the Utah territorial files in the National Archives, and nothing. In fact, the only thing I found was a fairly late article, October 15th, coming out of Ogden, of all places, that reports that the grand jury returned no indictments.
Interesting.
So the town kept a lid on it.
So fascinating. In the Salt Lake City case, there was no inquiry. In the Park City case, we have an inquiry, we have an investigation, we have a grand jury, but there's no indictment. So
well, I think that comes back to what you were saying earlier, Josh, which is that you know, the Salt Lake City murder was seen as sort of a murder of passion. You know, this one, there's a lot of plotting and strategizing.
Okay, so we've talked about 5 murders. There's a 6th. 4 years later, what happens?
So love this headline, in the heat of passion. What happens, it's election day, so they haven't been able to drink all day by law, right? So they're finally kicking back in a saloon. Joe Hughes is in with some of his buds, and a guy named Neil Malloy shows up. And Neil starts with a political discussion, but things kind of escalate. He's not happy with having been forced to vote for someone in his estimation. Joe's trying to talk him down about that. And then Malloy starts picking at Joe on the topic of the lynching and basically accusing him. Well, Joe's not a guy that's, you know, going to stand up to that. A recommendation is, you know, made that they take it outside, and they do. But on the way out the door, someone hands Neil Malloy a gun. He shoots Joe Hughes, and you know, not very kindly, shoots him in the gut. So several days later, Joe Hughes dies, and that's the last of our 6 murders.
And this is the only retribution, the only murder, the only infraction of any sort that we hear about. And yet there were 70, 100 people involved in this. And so 4 years later, this lid is kept on. But one time,
still a lot of pressure on the pressure cooker,
something,
right?
yeah. So the question I have for you, Sandy, is, was that the end?
Well, I don't know. The question is, what does the audience think? I'd love to, you know, have, you know, a little further engagement on this. I'm inclined to think that, you know, there's stories here that are untold.
There certainly seem to be. I mean, it's so fascinating that you have the park's silence for so many years, except for that one Hughes murder, that nothing comes up and nothing is exposed, and everyone here must be keeping a lid on it. It's fascinating to have a secret kept that strongly by so many people.
So as fate would have it, we've got a new friend, Josh, right? Our friend Lynn Bradshaw kind of showed up. She reached out to Diane via email, and she shares some additional information that I'm going to kind of pass along. She's done a fair bit of investigation into Jack Murphy himself, found things that I didn't see, and reports that, that he was indeed involved in union activities, that he had been a miner but had been injured, so he was crippled by his relationship with the mine. And she speculates that, perhaps one of the reasons that he was unpopular is not necessarily that he was unpopular with the other miners, but he was unpopular with the mine owners.
That's fascinating.
So, is there some attribute of retribution there? I don't know. This is my speculation, just kind of hearing the facts from Lynn. Her point of view is, hey, lynching of any kind is wrong, and even the death penalty is wrong. And, that's part of what was happening, in the cases being bounced back to the Supreme Court. It's a shifting of public perception, maybe a bending of the moral arc towards justice.
It's a great way to put it, and it's a fascinating story. Diane, any other questions from the audience that we could answer?
No further questions at this time.
Okay, let me, just one very kind of dark but funny story. The whole situation that we described, what happens in the Colville. I mean, it's pretty fascinating to see that these guys were kind of bungling. This whole thing was planned, but it was kind of it took them. It didn't go off as well planned as they thought it would.
Right.
And yet they were able to kind of, and they're dressed as women.
Right. That dressed as women part is just hilarious.
Yeah.
Right?
And why they had to do that, it's kind of, anyway. It's a fascinating story, and it's just a fascinating time in our history. And I'm glad we've had a chance to share it. And I'm glad, Sandy, that you've done all this great work on that.
Well, thank you for helping me shape the story, Josh, because we had a sort of loose pile of facts, and now there's a tale.
Yeah, well, and thank you, Diane, and the museum for allowing us to kind of present this today.
Well, we're thrilled that you presented it. So thank you so much. It was very informative. And please thank Gus and Ted from PCAV for their help tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to them, yeah.
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 And thank you to everyone who attended. We appreciate all your questions and all your feedback as well.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Okay.
And we're out.